All right, we are live and recording, and we are looking at the book of Judges, everyone's favorite book of the Old Testament. And I'll tell you this, I haven't read Judges for a long time, but I found myself reading a little bit more intently in some of these passages. This is a dark book.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, it's, there's all sorts of awfulness here. That if you dig into it, it doesn't make you feel good. Which, if you haven't looked at it, I mean, it's like gang rape and incest and polygamy and like just the litany of these things that are going on and the worst part about it is it's birthed in these sort of these evil that's coming out is within the Israelites. So what we have here in the Judges is we have the period between Joshua, and really he kind of dies early on in the book, but you get kind of the end of Joshua in the book of Joshua. You get Joshua again. Step back a previous book, Deuteronomy. They're about to enter the promised land. And then you have Joshua that we looked at last week, who brings the Israelites into this promised land. And one of the main things he does is he divides them up. And then he says, okay, now we're going to conquer the land. And as we enter into the Judges, we see the beginning of this conquering. But basically, if you want to just summarize Judges as a book as a whole, it's a lot of tribal conquests and stories that were compiled together over the years. And to the extent that the dating, actually, I was going back, the dating, I believe, is the sixth. We lost Jan and P. David. The dating goes back to the 6th century BCE, so 600 years before Christ was on the scene. And it basically is, if you look at it, and I was going through earlier today, and I was writing down the different reigns of the kings and the judges and who ruled here and there. You're talking, hundreds of years of Israelite occupation and captivity within the land and region of Canaan. And within all of their tribes that Joshua divided them up into. So you got to remember, they put the tabernacle, they put the Levites around them, and then they put the other tribes around them. As they went and God said, go conquer the Canaanites. This is your land. And really the command was to almost, in essence, genocide, extinguish the Canaanites in the land. And what we have is here, over a series of hundreds of years, you have the account of good kings and bad kings and disloyalty and unfaithfulness of Israel, and the times where they recommit themselves to God. You see God's favor with them, but the times where they don't, you see the fallenness of them. And if you look at the whole, and there's 21 chapters in the book, and we'll go through the breakdown in a second, but I just want to kind of highlight some of the major themes. But what I thought one of the interesting things was, and if you have your Bibles with you, Judges 2:11. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. 3:7. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. 3:12. The Israelites did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And it just goes on this. Chapter 4, it starts. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Chapter 6, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And this just goes on, and you have this, and it does taper off, I think, at some point, maybe I stopped marking them. But I started putting little skulls in my Bible of where there was some bad stuff going down, and there are skulls now all over the text. I started early on and just put a little skull head, thinking this is a good point to say this is a bad stuff. But as I made my way through, I was shocked at how many skulls I was putting in. And again, this is like a rated R movie. That's just violent. You got tent stakes being thrust through leaders' heads to kill people. You have a scene where someone of the Israelites takes his sword and he stabs a fat king, and it says it goes all the way up to the hilt so that the sword disappears and dirt comes out. So you just have, I know, Carrie's like, what? It is a horrible book.
how can we call it holy then?
Exactly. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Jim, because this is the interesting thing, again, about how we as Christians view the books of the Bible versus perhaps how the Jews view this. And so even before we get into all of the details, not too many details, but that's a great opening question. How do we, knowing we're going into a book that has all of these awful things that are done both in the name of the Lord and against the Israelites from the Lord, how do we, like, what is holy about this book? And so that's the sort of question to throw out there that we'll come back to at the end, is what is the purpose of Judges in terms of our understanding? Someone here is coming in. So just a few, are P. David and Jan separating? I mean, not like separating. I mean, like, their marriage is great, everyone. I wasn't saying that. You're just on two different things. All right. And one of you is muted, I see. I think we're not. Can you both hear us though? You have sound on both? All right. So Judges as a whole, Judges is a part of the Deuteronomic history. So it kind of goes through the history of Israel and its conquest and its leaders. And again, this gives you some hint as the purpose of Judges is it's a historical book within Israel's canon. I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them, but Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Hosea, and Jeremiah are considered the Deuteronomic histories. And they chronicle just the leadership. Ruth will be the next book, so we'll skip, and then before we get into Samuel, and with Samuel's in there too, but Ruth is not considered one of them because it's not considered history. It's a little vignette in terms of more of the genealogical nature, leading to Jesse and to Christ ultimately. But basically, you have this book that's pretty much about how Israel keeps messing up. And you have good kings and you have bad kings. And the larger picture that I want you to kind of grasp to, because it really is important to what it leads to, and that is that, again, the Israelites were formed in Abraham. We won't go back before that, with all the Noah and Adam and Eve. But when the Israelites were formed and they were brought to, and they were to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then they were in slavery, and then they left Egypt with Moses. And then they were in the wilderness for 40 years. And then they're on the verge of the promised land, and Moses goes and Joshua leads them in. And then basically before Joshua dies, he says the same thing that Moses said. If you obey God, blessings will follow. If you don't obey God, curses will follow, and it'll be bad for you. Now, you think that this whole new generation of Israelites that have journeyed through the desert and have no memory in terms of their actual physical life experience of being in Egypt. So the concept of slavery is only a story to them, built in the oral traditions of their parents. But they also now have the leaders of Israel saying, your parents were a rebellious generation and they had to be refined in the desert. Now you're a new generation. Renew yourselves in this covenant. But again, the covenant wasn't made with them. And what we have here in this book following Joshua, after he gives his admonition of just follow, be obedient, is absolute disobedience. And again, this is not like in a direct 30 years after. This is hundreds of years compiled through various kings. And part of that is, and they're considered tribal texts. And so part of it is you start out with the battles, say who's going out in the battle, and they say Judah, the tribe of Judah goes out in the battle, and then they start to go through different facets of the Israelites, the tribes of Israelites. But you have again this this concept of all these different tribes, and even that sense of 12 tribes, which they list in I think in chapter 1 or 2. There's not an emphasis on that number of tribes. The Levites are still there, but by chapter 5, they're only listing 10. And you're like, well, where did the other tribes go? Well, this wasn't, again, 50 years later. This was hundreds of years later and there's really no accounting for the differentiation of the tribes. They mentioned 2 minor tribes later that are ideas of sects, sects of tribes. And then there's also this idea that the Canaanites, and this is where the big, mistake that the Israelites made, that as they settled the land of Canaan, they were meant to obliterate the Canaanites because of their evil ways. But what we find again and again is the Israelites acquiescing to the rituals of the Canaanites in this land. So you got to imagine the Dead Sea, and then the Sea of Galilee up here. And then I think I'm doing this reverse for you. And then the Mediterranean is over here. Is that the right orientation for all of you? For the Mediterranean should be west in your mind of Jerusalem. Is this the west for you? I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So, the Mediterranean's over here. In that land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea down here, and the stretch that goes between them, this is the primary land we're talking about. This is where the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom get extended to. And so this is the land of Canaan in between. And so when they crossed over the Jordan, when they crossed over into Canaan, they were supposed to, again, obliterate everyone, get rid of everyone. It was essentially God-sanctioned genocide because they were so wicked. And they were sacrificing their children, and they were involved in all sorts of sexual immorality. And so it was rampant. And so God's like, get rid of them. But instead, we'll see, they actually take a lot of these the Canaanites into slavery. And they start to intermingle with them, and they start to adapt their worshiping of the false gods. And so the book of Judges becomes this sort of intermediary period where you have all of these tribes of Israel trying to figure out what new life is in this land. But they identify themselves by their tribal associations. And what this is leading to ultimately is the transition into after Ruth, and then you'll see a bit of that genealogy in the history of Ruth. But when you get into Samuel, you'll get into Jesse and King David. And ultimately what you're seeing is the need for a monarchy, basically, in Israel's formulation of who they are as a nation. And you might say that sense of, again, in a polytheistic world, where all the Amorites have all these different gods, and there are multiple gods, and they're manifested in this earth and sort of physical images. This idea of this radical monotheism, where the Israelites dedicate themselves to this one God, is challenged by the fact that they're facing all of this, and by establishing, and what this is leading to is by the establishment of that sense of one king. They, for the first time under King David, or really under Saul, and then eventually under David, you get this idea of Israel as a proper nation. Does that make sense? So in other words, they're divided, they experience that division, and then we're going to see this shift towards this idea that everyone is under one leadership. And the Israelites realize this too, because they're ruled by good and evil kings. But the judges aren't like, gavel and, sort of black robe sort of judges, although some of them do. Deborah, for example, actually does some judgment in that. But really, when you hear the word judges, don't conflate it with what we think of judges today. It's actually more of military leaders, tribal military leaders who are conquesting and heading out. And so they are military leaders who are exercising God's judgment, both on the foreigners outside the land, Canaan, and the ones who occupied there, and also then judgment on Israel. Now, here's what's interesting, just as we begin this narrative, and I just sort of keep in the back of your head, we in our day and age will look back, and I think it's hard to deny that we kind of took over this land from the indigenous cultures, from First Nations, and we share a collective sort of acknowledgement that probably was not the kindest thing to do, or the goodest, the best thing to do. We came in and we just plowed through, yet every nation in the history of the world has had some sort of takeover of another land. So it's not that was a unique situation, but we have basically a sanctioned move for the Israelites, but with a sense of justice, because the Canaanites were so evil. So it wasn't as if they were going in and they were just taking over a land as they wanted it. It was a sense of God's judgment on the Canaanites. And that's a nuance that's important to hold on to. Otherwise, it just looks like God's sort of sanctioning general genocide. Like, hey, the Canaanites occupied this land. This is where I saved for you, so let's get rid of them. And not to say that there wasn't still brutality that we can't deny but associate with the Israelites. But at the same time, there's that sense of they were enacting God's judgment on the Canaanites, or they were supposed to be enacting God's judgment through their conquests, even in ones where they were outnumbered in small numbers. They took over.
Why was God so brutal?
I mean, why? I think it was more so dealing with the mentality of the people at the time. It would be my guess, Jim. I mean, we have fashioned the image of God. We have fashioned God in the image of someone, of a deity that is always peaceful and loving and somewhat cuddly, and always wants the best for us. And yes, while there is that, I think sometimes as Christians in a Western world, we forget the fact that the Jews, for God's chosen people, have gone through the ringer, more times than you would think they deserved, and they still. I mean, even in the New Testament, I mean, like, it's a constant sense of and even then, when Christ calls Gentiles into and change the game, there's still not a sense of cushy life. There's always a sense, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, that those who follow God or Yahweh, or whatever you want to frame that in terms of the testaments, that we have entered into a place where we are experiencing persecution and suffering and rejection, because the very things that this world tends to uphold, we are called to reject. Now we have made that a lot softer in our modern day era, but if you really want to look at, and so I think that sense of harshness is probably more in line with the judgment of, and you guys say, well, why do we have this idea of God as this judgmental sort of sinners in the hands of an angry God? Well, it's not far-fetched to think that, because the evidence is there. Which is why I think in this passage, for me, the idea that God was cleansing that land almost makes it easier. So I'm not saying I'm rationalizing it to some extent, but a little bit.
Well, when he didn't tell them to kill them in the brutal ways that they did, though. I mean, they were just supposed to destroy the Canaanites. There was one that I was looking at today. They cut off this king's thumbs and his toes. What's the point of that? I mean, why?
I don't know. It said that. I saw that. That was my first skull.
What's that?
That was the first skull I drew. I was like, ew, that's gross.
I know. I mean, and then you kind of understand God's rationale, because if they didn't destroy them, but they took them as slaves, and then they began to be corrupted by them, so they couldn't really show mercy, because that's what happened. Then they began to absorb the influence from them. So,
and intermix. So,
right.
I mean, the reality is there's Canaanite blood in Judaism. So there's probably no such thing as a complete pure race, but yeah, I don't know. Glenn is referring to right in that first chapter. It says, but they pursued him, caught him, cut off his thumbs and big toes. And then he said, 70 kings with their thumbs and toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. So it was that sense of dominant. I mean, I don't know.
Toes.
Well,
opposable thumbs.
I'm going to make another point, but share what you were saying. If you have no thumbs, what happens if you have no
grab anything?
You can't grab anything.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't have any big toes, you lose balance.
If you have
You
no
can't
big
run.
toes, you lose your balance. So there's a message, or what he was sharing.
Words of wisdom from Burton.
Yeah, he's
on fire tonight.
He's on fire. Yeah.
But that's one thing that makes us different from animals too, is that we have the opposable thumb.
As do primates.
As do the primates, yes. But I mean, not most animals. So.
But that's an evolutionary theory we won't delve into too deeply today.
Right. I mean, to dehumanize him?
I honestly, we don't. I mean, I didn't read too deeply on that, because really it's just conjecture or speculation at that point of why they would have done that. Who knows? I mean, that honestly, as you read through the book, that seems like the least of the mean things that they did. Right. But what's that, Nora?
I was just going to share, isn't the real heart of the message is that here we are in Judges, and they're kind of roaming on their own, and God said, don't mingle, be separate, be holy, or that's the message. You're supposed to be separate. So it's today. If you don't separate yourself from the world, then you're going to get contaminated. And that's what happens. I mean, things away from God, those horrible, evil things happen.
Yeah.
And so it's a lesson in learning your faith. That's hard to step aside in spite of what's around you, to have faith and trust God. So mixing up, and it seems like it was I was reading in that there were 7 oppressions and 7 I mean, it just messed it up, and it was all from idolatry, immorality, departing from God, and then it just got to be the worst. Just a big mixture of bad stuff.
It was. And that's really, and again, these are not all in sequence. I'll note where a few places where they actually had lapses, and there was 23 years here, there was 40 years there, and so there's, and what you have really, if you chart, and I kind of remembered, I didn't see if I could find a chart, but I remember back in seminary going through the Old Testament history, and I remember the professor on the board drawing these up and down things, saying this was a good king, this is a bad king, this was a good king, this is a bad king. And what you have is you have this cycle of bad king, then Israelites are oppressed, and then Israelites find some place of repentance, and then their deliverance, then they have a season of good peace with a good king, and then something happens where the Israelites compromise their holiness, again, not perfection, that set apartness of the land, and they find themselves compromised, and then they have a bad king, and then they are oppressed. And so you have this sort of cycle running through this book. But again, that's why it's important to hold these as separate little teeny vignettes that have all been squished together. And they said, again, the 6th century. So this was likely, it happened around the 10th century, they said, or historians sort of date this around the 10th century, 11th and 10th century, but the 6th century. So that's roughly 400 years before these things were compiled into some form that we have them. So not that it represented those 400 years, but there were several hundred years in between the time where these events actually happened. And you actually have clues to that as you're reading it. It often talks in past tense in a way that almost frames it as this is what happened. So again, you have to ask yourselves, and one commentator that I read said that actually, if you look at it through a 6th century lens, and I don't have any idea really, I didn't go down that path too far, but if you look at it from a 6th century lens, they actually, there's suspicion that the book of Judges was compiled with how the reception of the stories would be perceived or heard in the 6th century. So it has a bit of a 6th century flavor over and against the actual time of the actual events. And that's not a bad thing. That's just, I mean, for those of you who like the message, I mean, there's a reinterpretation of that's even in our present day context, where it reflects the language and idioms and perspectives of modern day times. It's easy for us to look back at the Old Testament and look at it through that Christocentric lens, where we're like, oh, this always makes sense. Well, if you don't have the New Testament, you're only looking at the Old Testament, well, then a lot of those, and you don't have any concept of who Christ is, a lot of those passages will look very differently. So it's always in that context of not only when it was actually happening, but in the context of when it was compiled or assembled or canonized in the Jewish tradition. It's going to have those outside influences, and we believe that God directed those who were compiling. And was present, and the authority of that comes through. But again, this is something this book really doesn't have a lot of spiritual virtue in it, other than the fact that, like, if you disobey and are rebellious, you're going to get punished. And if you're obedient and faithful, you're going to experience God's blessings. So for successive generations of Israelites, these stories were important. Because again, we operate with that ethical, moral understanding where, oh, this makes sense. Of course, I will do it. It's the what we call it is the idea of the like a Platonic notion of it, of if you say something is true and good, and that resonates with me and my understanding, I'm going to go ahead and do it. Where they didn't have that sense. These were values that were being held for them, but they didn't have that internal spirit that oriented towards that behavior. Their sense of obedience had to come out of really a wrestling with the will and denying one's own sort of a fallen nature, earthly, fleshly nature, and really sort of throwing one's. So we don't want to judge them too harshly, because it's particular from a post-Pentecostal perspective, or Pentecost perspective. But at the same time, this is the story of Israelites' journey in this intertribal time before they coalesced. Before the beginning of the story of Saul and King David and that really establishment of that monarchy. Okay. I think, is there anything else that I needed to? The other thing I note, there's a couple passages later on that describe it and say, in those days, Israel had no king. And so there's a series of 3 or 4, I think, sections that start where they're noting that there was a lack of leadership. So they've gone through these reigns of kings and ruling over them and subjugating them and them subjugating the others. And so there's the concept of a king, but there was at some point realization that the Israel was fragmented and its tribal nature, and they needed some sort of king to draw them together against the outside forces. So that's kind of the overview. I think, what else?
Jason,
yeah.
so I'm a little confused on the chronology. I thought you started off by saying it was 200 BC, and then I heard you say it was compiled in 600 AD, or am I mishearing?
No, BC. All the dates that we talked about were all BC. No,
Okay.
It probably happened about 10th century BC.
Okay.
So 1,000 years before Christ. And then the book itself was considered compiled and beginning the process of canonization within the Jewish tradition around the 6th century.
BC.
So BC, before Christ was ever on the scene.
Okay.
Jason, mine says, I have a child's Bible, and I know that's kind of silly, but with my stroke, it's different.
Not silly, but I am interested in what you're about to say.
It says the events in this book, Judges, happened during 1390 and 1050 BC. Is that about right?
1390 and 1050. Yeah, I mean, that's in 10th century. I mean, that dates it a little bit earlier.
Okay, so BC means before Christ?
Well, BC, loosely means before Christ, and then AD is actually a Latin term that I don't ever remember what it means, but it basically means after Christ. Anytime after Christ is around. But really, in terms of broader academia and scholarship, very few people use BC and AD anymore. They typically use BCE, which means before Common Era, or CE, which means Common Era. And really, AD doesn't even refer to Christ. That's something that Christians sort of, and the idea behind that is if we're talking about the reason they changed BC and AD to BCE, before Common Era, and Common Era, is that not everyone is looking at it from a Christian perspective. Like we make Christ's birth kind of the defining, and it happens just in the Western world, and it spread beyond that. That as we reset time according to this Jewish Christian understanding of the calendar.
So what does AD represent?
Does anyone know what the Latin is for it?
Anno Domini.
Yeah. After the Lord. After Ad.
Is that
the year of our Lord?
The year of our Lord.
So is that considered Common Era? AD considered Common Era?
AD is considered the Common Era. And before that is considered before Common Era. But I still use AD and BC because people, it's easier to use. But if I was writing it in anything, I would use BC or BCE just because I don't want to face critiques.
Okay. Okay.
Just to appease other people.
Jason,
What's that?
What made that change? When did that change come about?
I don't know when it came. I don't know.
Like
if I had to guess, I would say in the last 50 years, and I'm hedging my bets because it may even be sooner than that.
50 years? No.
What's that?
I bet it's in the last 10 years.
It might be in the last 10. No, it's at least 20 years because during my grad school, it was common to use. But I had not been exposed to that probably before the late 90s. So Wheaton was the first time I had encountered it. So,
Jason.
Yeah. Did someone say Jason?
I just said thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go through anything else. Okay, well, feel free to chime in or ask. So what happens now is just going to give you an overview. The first 1 to 2, chapters 1 and 2, you have kind of dealing with, and you can turn to your, if you want to follow along, we'll kind of go through, but let me give you the broad overview. You have failure to deal with the Canaanites. So it's kind of like, hey, here's 2 chapters about how the Israelites messed up and couldn't deal properly with the Canaanites. And you see the beginning of what eventually becomes almost a prototype for the rest of the book of, again, Israelites' disobedience by the adaptation of Canaanite customs or incorporating them into the life of the Israelites. And then you have a switch at some point where the Israelites, because they didn't do what was right in the sight of the Lord, and then they're oppressed, and they come to a place of repentance, and then God delivers them to a new reign. Again, you're going to see that cycle again and again throughout this. And my guess is that sense of cycle probably dominated the compilation of this. They're seeing, they're matching accounts, and so when they compile these things, they try to do them in a chronological order, but with that sense of rhythm. In chapters 3 through really almost 16, you have sort of demonstrations of the corruption of the different judges and the way God is judged. You'll have Othniel and Ehud and Shamgar, who are sort of in chapter 3, and we'll look at those briefly. And that's where things were going okay. They were favorable. They were operating as judges that were favorable in the sight of the Lord. Deborah comes on the scene. She's the only one in chapter 4 and 5. And God leads her to victory. And she's the only one who has a real sense of sort of like judge, like making a determination. And she actually stands as one of those key female figures in scripture of early leadership of females. And so she was a prophetess, not only a judge. In other words, she didn't occupy that same strong sense of military leadership, but there was a nuance of sort of judgment and wisdom and prophecy around her. You find in chapter 5 her song of deliverance, and we'll highlight a few things there when we come back to that. Chapters 6 through 9, you generally have the story of Gideon, who's one of those lost figures of the Bible that we kind of get in Sunday school, kind of grouped in with some folks. I remember hearing about Gideon. He defeats the Midianites, but then eventually his leadership turns to idolatry and leading to death again into that cycle. And we'll see that again and again. 10 through 12, you have Japheth. He defeats the Amorites, and Israel at that point has completely forgotten any sense of the covenant, and it notes that. And then you have from 13 to 16, probably a story that we're all familiar with because they made a movie about it, Samson, of the strong man, of the strong prophet who was drawn into the arms of Delilah and tricked by Delilah, and they cut off his hair, and he lost his sight, or he's lost his strength, and then they plucked out his eyes. And you see this sort of figure of this arrogant, cocky judge who then, basically the story ends of him pushing down the columns and destroying a whole bunch of people. So it's again, but that's God's judgment on, and God used Samson as a judge of the foreigners at the time in that area and they experienced that judgment through death in this case. 17 and 18, you get Micah, where he gets in trouble because he builds a private temple and tries to privatize spirituality. And then I believe it's his son, Dan, and ultimately makes that right. And we see again and again throughout these stories of God turning the Israelite messes to redemption, but not without them experiencing suffering and pain. So this is a refining process throughout the way, and then that leads us then to 1921. That brings the sort of book to a close. Again, leading it right up to the book of Ruth, which is kind of an interloper in terms of the history, but it's an important one that sort of demonstrates the genealogical connection between what was happening in Judges and the beginning of Jesse being David's father and leading to that line. So any questions about that overview? And then we're going to actually go through some of the things, and if you have your Bible, now at the time where we'll go through it chapter by chapter.
Is it also the message that, I mean, there's a lot of different leaders. Is it also talking about they had a good leader, they stayed faithful, but when the leaders went astray, the people went astray?
That you could say that. To what extent the leaders actually had control over the unfaithfulness of the people, I don't know. I mean, again, because you're talking, thousands upon thousands of people in a very early primitive type of civilization. So it's not like they had the internet where they could say, hey, everyone stay home today because there's a problem. So even though you had a good king or a bad king, I think not that it didn't play itself out in the life of the Israelites, but I don't think it was like, hey, the king got up and gave it an address and told people how to act and they just all followed or not followed. And again, remember, the generational cycles were 40 to 60 years at this point. So you had those generational cycles rotating around. So every single one of these different Israelites. So that's, again, why this record is so important, because each successive generation of Israelites would want to revisit those failures. And the ultimate goal for the Israelite people is that, hey, you need to obey, because when you do, God's blessings will be with you. But when you are unfaithful and you do not make yourselves separate or set yourselves apart from the rest of the world, calamity will follow.
Doesn't that sound like prosperity gospel?
A little in the sense of cause and effect. But you could say the same thing for us, even this day, even though we've received salvation by grace. If you're unfaithful to God, calamity may befall you. If you're faithful, calamity still may befall you, but you'll still be in God's good blessings.
I know a lot of people that are not good people, but they have a lot of blessing.
Well, it depends how you define blessing, Jim.
Well, that's true.
If you're talking finances,
yeah,
then there are lots of rich kings in the world that were evil. And I think that there is our Western mindset, sort of Protestant work ethic of American exceptionalism that we hold on to, whereas that really isn't what, if anything, God has called the Israelites to set themselves apart. And the other thing to note about, I was going to say, is that the Israelites enslaved the Canaanites, and the very thing that God does in back in Deuteronomy was like, hey, I want to set you apart, and introduces this notion of justice. And so the Israelites were supposed to not be like the other tribes and other people groups, that were not Israelites. They were supposed to be compassionate and show mercy, and they were supposed to be this sort of beacon of light. And not that God still wasn't destroying some folks, but in their dealings, they were, outside of God's command to destroy, they were supposed to be caring for their neighbors to some extent.
So laziness was their downfall.
Laziness or
somebody else to do their work.
Honestly, there's part of me that says they just didn't really. I wonder if they had the mental capacity to really do it. I think that we have evolved as a human race in terms of our understanding and our empathy and our understanding of society and social systems and how we function and ought to, and idealism that we could live together. And I just don't think they had those back then. It was a pretty simple, basic, existence. So, Carla, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I have a question. Compared to then versus now, is it true that they lived to 100 and 140, 50 years old when most people die when they're 60, 70? And what is that true? And if so, what is the difference between then and now? And why do we not live that long?
We don't. You have a gradual decrease of lifespan throughout really the Genesis. You see it go from, whatever I don't remember his name. Who's Methuselah, the oldest guy in the Bible, who I don't know 800 years or something. But and honestly, in my opinion, and I don't really have a whole lot of, this is purely Jason's opinion, that when we introduced meat,
Yeah.
something happened in between Noah's time where they were living a lot longer, and then all of a sudden meat was introduced into the diet, and then you start to see this shrinking of it. And so even Abraham, 100 years at that point was long. Like it was like you were doing, kind of like it is now. But given the life conditions, you have life expectancy shortened. And then, and again, you don't know how, I mean, some people live longer, some people live shorter. And obviously we have more advanced means to keep people alive. But in that time they didn't. So
You'd think it might just have been the way they kept time. I mean,
it could be the way they kept time as well.
I mean, it could just be that. I mean,
Never thought about that. It's a good point, Jim.
So I can't speak to that, but I've often wondered that if different seasons and places they kept time. Although there is some sense of I think even early on, they would have had some sense of season and time and cyclical nature and moons. And at some point and this point, they probably hadn't started tracking all that stuff, but at some point they do. And it sort of comes to, before Christ's time, they had a definitely sense of time and day. And, but where they were at in that point, who knows?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if you have your Bibles with you, open them up. It starts with Israel's failure. You have a nice vignette of the thumbs and big toes cutting off. I just like that it says big toes. You have the first sort of, you have some battles that are being won. And then in 127, it says Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants. And it says, but the Canaanites continued to live in that land. So there was a sense of they didn't drive them out. They didn't kill them. They weren't trying to clear the land of the Canaanites. They allowed them to dwell. So, but they put the Canaanites to forced labor. And then it says, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites, but the Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. So the irony of it is their Israelites are in slavery for 400 years. And what is the first thing they do after God commands them to rid the people of the land is they actually do just the opposite. They allow them to stay, they live with them, and then they subjugate them. And this is not, and I know that there's a sense of getting rid of, but this is not what God called them to do. So the Israelites are participating in a form of societal slavery and servitude from the Canaanites. In chapter 2, you see this passage in verse, the second part of verse 1 and into 2, it says, God is speaking to them. He said, I'll never break my covenant with you. Again, we see God's faithfulness. No matter what's happening, I'm not breaking that covenant. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my commandments, and see what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, and they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare upon you. So God's saying, you didn't obey. You have in this first chapter, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You allowed them to live here. You subjected them to slavery, and because of that, now there are going to be some effects. And so then it gets really good. And then Joshua dies, and they have that, and they buried his bones. And then you have in chapter 2, verse 11, you have the first instance of, then the Israelites did what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and they worship Baals, the gods of the Canaanites. And then you see in chapter 2, verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. So they did not listen, yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hands of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groanings because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel whether or not they would take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their ancestors did. The Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua. So that was the end of chapter 2, leading up to verse 22, 23. So you have basically an encapsulation of the entire book of Judges in that second part of the chapter of 2, from 11 really all the way to the end of the chapter. And then they have basically the beginning of this series of tribal vignettes. You have the nations remaining in the land. There's sort of an account of them. It even says at the bottom of that, so the Israelites lived among the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. And so that's not a reference to, just to be clear, that's not an ancestral reference. That is they, being the Canaanites, taking for sisters, for their daughters, the Canaanite daughters, for their wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. So that's in reference to the other tribal nations there at the time. So there was an intermingling, not only in customs, but genetically there was an intermingling from those who lived in the land and the Israelites. Okay, and feel free to interrupt. Then you have in 3:7, you have the beginning of Othniel or Othanal. And again, it's verse 7. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping. And he goes on. And again in verse 12, the Israelites did what was right in the right in the sight of the Lord, evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened. And so you have this again, just this reiteration, this cadence around this verse. The Israelites did what they wanted to do, and these were the consequences that followed. But it says at the end in verse 11, under Othanal, they lived 40 years. And it ultimately led to 40 years of some rest. And then when Othanal's son died, the Israelites did again. And so you have this, by the end of Othanal, you have this good stuff that was happening, and then it turned bad. And then again, you have 18 years of that reign of Ehud. And then it goes on. And that's where just to point out the gross parts of scripture, the junior high boy in me still thinks it's, fascinating. But you have that chapter 3 verses down into 20. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber and said, I have a message from you from God. So he rose from his seat. And then Ehud reached into his left hand, took a sword that he had hidden from his right thigh and thrust it into Elong's belly. And the hilt went so far in after the blade that the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and dirt came out.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Which verse is that? 3 what?
3 and then the low 20s, 21, 22.
Starts in 20, Nora.
Starts in
Okay.
20. So now we're going to get out some paper. We're going to draw. We're going to illustrate some of these pictures. In fact, I haven't looked, but I bet in the Brick Testament, the Lego version of it, they probably did these. So anyway, moving on, you have in 31, chapter 3, 31. What's that?
You need to put an R rating on this.
Well, the funny thing is that if you look at the Brick Testament, they do rate it R. It's not safe for office consumption. And so, and here, let me see, just for the sake of this here, if you haven't seen it, the Brick Testament, you're welcome to borrow it when Silas comes into my office to hang out with me, sometimes this is what he reads. But it is all of it is directly from the scriptures. So it's not, so here you have, I know that it doesn't look like they have that one, but I know they did JL when he stabs him in the, oh, here we go. There's the king for you. I won't read you the whole thing, but that's the fat guy
Oh,
who got, so they even, and so, yes, if you want to borrow this, you can, but it has all of this, it has many of the stories. And again, obviously, if they're going to take the time to stick it in Lego form, they're probably going to pick the worst passages, the grossest passages.
Jason,
Yeah.
what strikes me is how it doesn't leave out anything. It doesn't clean up the story in any way. Just the fact that it says he must be out relieving himself. I mean, it's human life and it's nothing cleaned up. It's not written like you would think a Sunday school story would be written or anything like that. And when we learn about it in Sunday school, it's all cleaned up. But
Edited
when
version.
you read it, actually, it's life. It's like life really is. And that's what
Yes.
strikes me as we go through it.
Yeah.
Well, and we, absolutely, Donna, that's spot on. I think that, and that's why I think if we, sometimes they say, if you want junior high boys to be interested in Sunday school, you got to look at the right passages. But there is that sense of, we have sterilized life so much. And in my short commentary on that is we've made birth taboo, we've made death taboo, and we've made sex taboo. And all of those things are so intricately tied to one another in many ways that when we make all of these things in life taboo, we don't actually deal with them as a matter of fact. We avoid, we privatize birth, we avoid death by, our elderly are now in nursing homes and we schedule C-sections to make it convenient for everyone, as opposed to saying these are natural parts of our lives and they affect us in natural ways. At the end of 3, you have Shamgar. It doesn't say much about him, but after him came Shamgar, the son of so-and-so, who killed 600 of the Philistines, and he too delivered Israel. So again, they had some fragment of this guy who did something good. They didn't really have much information about him, it's not like they were filtering it. They probably just knew that some dude named Shamgar did this, had this fable about him, so they included it in the text. Then you have Deborah and Barak. And again, it starts off in chapter 4. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hands of King Jabin of Canaan. And at that time, Deborah was a prophetess, a wife, and she is the one who's in that first part of 4 exercises of judgment and has signs of that sense of justice. It leads down to what in seminary became one of the most famous passages, because it was kind of like the one that no one recognized. But later in 4, towards the end of it, you have Jael, who came out and is standing and is told to stand outside of a tent. So he turned aside to her in the tent, and she covered him with a rug, and he said to her, "Give me a little water to drink and stand outside the tent." But it says Jael, the wife of Heber, took the tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him, so sneakily, and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. And he was lying fast asleep from weariness and died. So you have this image of this like complete, through the temple of the other side. Again, yeah, this is not the stuff that we, and I know that's illustrated in the Brick Testament, but you have this sense, but that was looked at as like a good thing, like it was happening, and that God was delivering them. So then you have the Song of Deborah that follows and contains most of the chapter of 5, and that's really about both her judgment and the military conquest of the time and God's and again a lot of the names and passages and things that surround these texts are important to the history of Israel, although they may not seem important to us. But again, at the end of chapter 5, it says the land had rested for 40 years. So there was another period. Again, at this point, we're up to probably 150, 160 years of accounted time that, again, from Carla's Bible or to somewhere between the 13th or 12th century to the 10th century, you have that sense of these events were happening. Chapter 6, you have the beginning of Gideon, the Midianite oppression. You have Gideon's, and Gideon is the first prophet that God explicitly calls. Yeah, Jim or Glenda.
Yeah, it just, you said about 150 years had elapsed from the start of the book.
I'm just roughly calculating and again, it doesn't, if you calculate how many years of each reign, which they would have had as record, it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't gaps in between, but there was at least, I mean, you know, a couple 40-year, a couple 22s, 23s in there that extended it. So I'm just loosely adding up that this was going on in that time period.
For the number of people that were killed during that kind of a time frame, isn't that I mean, pretty soon you'd think they'd wipe out the whole population of the world, because there was so much death during that amount of time. It would. And
well, you had a lot of women who weren't in battle, and you didn't really have the concept or the really of contraception. That wasn't really to the last century, but you also didn't have the concept of really an understanding of the biological nature of the female reproductive system. So no one was like, trying to control the amount of kids they had. So they're just churning these things out left and right. People just, so I think there was a constantly replenishing of people. Someone was probably always pregnant at any given time. And they were also having kids a lot earlier. So it wasn't as like there was this period where they were like, oh, okay, you're in your 25. Maybe you should settle down and do something and have a family. Back in that day, the minute you were past your first menstrual cycle and had the capacity to be childbearing, you were. All these things, fun things that you never would have ever thought we would have talked about in a Bible.
I mean, there were just bloodbaths all the time. The land would reek of the blood, you'd think.
I know, the dead bodies, and you think about it again, but this is time, 40 years, you're talking about one king's reign over 40 years.
Yeah.
So, that's a long time to think about. There's a duration of just the journey of the Israelites in relationship to the, this is like a drop in the bucket in terms of that time span that gives you just a snapshot of what it was. But again, it's not necessarily meant to focus on the details. And you got to wonder, they're going to include whatever details they had. There weren't like, when they talk about people compiling stuff, the only reason they wouldn't include probably something was if it was incomplete or didn't make sense or didn't contribute. If they had oral history that was written down in some way and they're compiling a book, they're going to compile with any credible source or reliable source or reasonably so that they have. So they're not going to filter it because, again, these were conquests at that time. It was like, hey, look, God delivered us, and he killed all the Canaanites, or killed this tribe, so we were victorious. And they wanted successive generations to understand that. Gideon as a whole section, sort of 6 through 9. There's this and the one thing to note about Gideon that I think is important is that Gideon again was the first prophet that God sort of distinctly called. And was in like a direct relationship with God. And then in that chapter in 6:36, you have this notion of the fleece where Gideon's basically testing God. And you have God showing up and, with the fleece, he said, lay out the fleece. And if the fleece is filled with moisture and the ground is dry, and then he did it again, said, now let's reverse it. Now have the fleece be dry and the ground wet. And God met him in that. And you have basically 7, 8, and 9, sort of the journey of Gideon, both good and bad, ending towards the end of 8, where Gideon demonstrates idolatry, and that he is sort of drifting away from God. And then to the point where at the end of 8, you have the death of Gideon. In the beginning of Abimelech's rule, and Abimelech is the first judge or leader of Israel that attempts to sort of establish some sense of monarchy or government or central system to rule over the Israelites. And again, that nation mentality that we saw come out of Israel in terms of the people group was again divided by Joshua, and you're seeing this period of these tribes wrestling with what it meant, and they're integrating and they're spreading out. And this is a gigantic geographic region. Far north of what our modern day Israel is, up into, beyond the Sea of Galaxy, and then down far. So there's a lot, we may think of the 12 tribes as being close, like they were kin, And they were all part of Israel, but they didn't live. It wasn't like, hey, let's go pop over and see some of the tribe of Judah. They were no longer camped around the tabernacle where they have had those access. They were sending them out and spreading them out. That diaspora, if you will. Noting the time here. Again, we'll go back. We'll skip ahead to chapter 10 and Japheth. And you have the beginning again. 10:6. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then right before that, you have Tola and Jair. And again, you have another 50-year period that passes there. And again, it's just that same cycle. And if you dig into these books, you're going to see the same thing, where it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And that same cycle of up and down is the Israelites adapt to customs, do something against what God says about being set apart. And then the Israelites are oppressed, or find some military defeat that God allows to happen to them. The Israelites come to a place of repentance, and deliverance comes from that. So you get into chapter 11, and really 11 and 12 get into Japheth's what he had done, and the Spirit of the Lord had been with him, and so there was a period of a good time, and then leading to 12 where it got kind of bad again, and again that up and down sense. And what did I have here? Oh yeah, I just noted someplace that some guy couldn't pronounce a word right, and they killed him for that. And then you get in chapter 13, and this is the story that we all love. At least I did as a kid. I loved I don't know, has anyone ever seen the motion picture Samson growing up? Was that a thing? Just my father subjecting me to that. Jim did. Jim really, okay, good. I'd like to know that I'm not alone in that. I watched a strange mix of movies. My dad would always get all of the biblical features. So, all of those, 10 Commandments and Samson and Jesus of Nazareth and Masada and all those sort of biblical ones. I got subjected to those, and to show State Fair and Snowball, all those sort of Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and then also James Bond and Elvis Presley movies. That was my viewing as a kid. It was mixed medium. But Samson was one of my favorite. I just loved it. There was such a power in the character of him, and in the end, even though he was a failure, he still brought God's judgment. And again, in chapter 13, at the beginning of the birth of Samson, the Israelites did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them to the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So you have the Israelites subjected to the Philistines. You have Samson's marriage, and he eventually falls into the arms of Delilah and is tempted by that. So he's infidelity and promiscuity. You have this exchange between Samson and the Philistines about riddles, and he's beating him up with the jawbone of an ass, and you have this wonderful story of this sort of overcoming of Samson. But eventually, in a strange way, and this is kind of like superhero stuff, like God gave Samson, this judge, a super or extraordinary strength, and it was bound to his hair. Like, you can't get much more superhero stuff than that. And so all it took was getting drunk, and then he cut his hair off, and now he's got no power anymore. Like, seriously, like either that's a real strong dose of folklore and myth, but I like to believe that God gave him supernatural, like he was like a modern day or an ancient day superhero, just with long flow, like Fabio. That was a test to see who would laugh at that joke. But in that, again, with Samson, you have that judgment on the Philistines through God. So even though you have unfaithfulness with Samson, you have God's eternal faithfulness coming in. You have Samson's death at the end of 16, and then you have the process of Micah and his son Dan coming on the scene, and then you finally get in the first time in chapter 18. The beginning of it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. So they have this, the first part of the book has the succession of the up and down, good, bad, good king, bad king, a series of judges that were correcting these things, God intervening and allowing punishment to happen. And then you have this transition from 18 on where there was no king. And this is setting the stage. It's foreshadowing for Saul and King David and the establishment of the of the nation's Israel. And then, you get into chapter 19 and 20, and let me just say it is awful. If you haven't read 1920, it's not a pretty verse. It literally is gang rape of someone's concubine and their daughter, and offered to the men of the town, thrown out to the point of death. So put aside the whole notion of junior high, thinking it's funny that someone was at a tent stake go through their temple, and junior hires would love that. This is where it gets so dark. I think it's actually one of the darkest passages in Scripture. So, but you have this deep sense of darkness overcoming, and so you got to take now step back and take the whole idea of Israel. When Joshua led them into the promised land, they were refined and not, participating in the slavery that happened before that, and they make this covenant and they renew their covenant to God, and then you have a series of a couple hundred years where we just see this darkness come over and this depravity to the extent where you just see absolute human subjugation and disrespect for human life, and it kind of and the book kind of ends that way. In terms of what the condition that the Israelites were in. And it doesn't leave you at the end of the book with a real sense of redemption. And then at the end, the very last verse of the entire chapter or the entire book says, in 25, Judges 21:25 says, in those days there was no king of Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And I think that's really interesting, considering the vast relativity we have in our culture, where authority has been shifted from larger structures of religious understanding or spiritual or faith-based understanding to civil society and we really live in a day and age. And again, that's the beginning of the end of that modern era that ended around 1950 and led to that postmodern era that kind of came in the 60s and 70s and led up to where we're at now. That sense of individual authority, that we are the determiners of what is right and wrong. And now we may say, oh, it's horrible, everyone thinks it's relative, but we kind of do that regardless of whether you're a product of the modern era. Meaning if you're an early boomer, you probably have more influence. Even most of the boomers would have some of that modern era influence on them, that sense of right and wrong and absolute nature of what's there, right and wrong, that came from the societal structure. We no longer have that. And we are at a place where it really is people do what is right in their own eyes. And so we're dealing with that sense of a lack of a sociologist, I think Peter Berger called it, there used to be just like a canopy, a sacred canopy that existed. And even though it was different religions, you still had, it's kind of like going back to, if you ever, again, The Simpsons, I always go to The Simpsons, that ideal of The Simpsons on Sunday morning. Even if you weren't Christian, if you were a Jew, you would have been in the synagogue the night before, the day before. If you were a Muslim, you would, or a Hindu, there was a sense still of a sense of sacredness over all of creation. We don't live in that place. Now everyone's walking around with their own little umbrella that says, this is my spirituality, this is my understanding of God, this is my sense of authority of the Scripture and of Revelation. And if you agree with me, you can come and hang out with me in my umbrella, and we'll protect ourselves from the rain together.
Jason,
yeah.
Even though they had all this individual freedom, they still realized that they needed some sort of authority, don't you think? That this individual freedom wasn't all it was cracked up to be, that they needed a structure. They needed some limits and borders.
I think there probably were less individual freedoms expressed then, and it wasn't about personal preference as much as it was about the determination of what was being set apart and what was not being set apart. And it is very clear that the Israelites, not having that sense of cultural or religious or formative identity that they were making those decisions in different tribes in different ways. Okay, I think that's it from my end. What thoughts are running through your head? So the question that we started with is, what does this say? What was the way you phrased it, Jim? What does this say about who God is?
No, well, I said, what is the purpose of Judges and what is he trying to do? But why is this book considered holy? That's what I was asking. I mean, it just, to me, I look at this book, I will never read it. I won't read it. It just is just too sickening of what people can do to people. And, if it's a summary, yeah, I might look at the summary, but it's just a horrible book. And I don't see any redemption out of the book myself. So,
has anyone ever totaled the number of people that were killed in this book?
I'm sure someone has counted them.
Because every time, I mean, but 18,000 killed here and 6,000 killed there, and it's just thousands and thousands of deaths in this book.
So Jason, what is the purpose of? Why is it in the Bible?
What, anyone else want to throw out their thoughts on that before I chime in?
I think there's a distinct purpose in it. You think being a Christian is a bowl of cherries? When you're distant from God, you are in the pits. And
Little pun on
Like
it.
cherry pits?
cycle of sin.
Sorry, I
I
couldn't
like that
resist.
one.
It's a cycle of sin. And here we are, and they're wanting to see where they can get a king, and they wanted to have a king. But even today, you don't need a king that's a monarch somewhere. You need the king in your life, in your heart. And
But they didn't
that's
have that option, Nora.
Pardon me?
They didn't have that
No.
option.
They were new. They were new to the scene. They had been slaves, and they didn't have any option of freedom. But then they did get to, you would think if somebody like us were back there in the Dead Sea or the Red Sea crossing, that's Almighty God. And the same thing, where look at what happened to Samson. He had that supernatural strength where that didn't come from himself. It came from God. And he didn't recognize, he didn't know how to deal with it. So they didn't know how to deal with sin. Sometimes we're lucky, or that we can really be trained and know, but it still gets back to the same basics. There is a cycle of sin, and addictions, look what they are.
Yeah.
If there's
Maybe to answer Jim's question, maybe the purpose is to show the utter depravity of human nature.
Yeah.
where it's just
Sinful.
the presence of God.
Well, I also think it shows, I go back to the holiness of God and his divine purpose
Yeah.
in the whole history of the Israelites. And it seems like the human nature got so bad, then God would raise up a judge. The judge didn't do it on his own power. It was always came from God. And then it shows how the judge was, he was flawed too. Just like nowadays, we have people are flawed. God uses them, but then they're flawed and they mess up again. So I think that's partly why it's in the Bible. It's to show us God's plan and that he's in charge and that he's looking into all of this.
And he's faithful.
Like
Now,
spirits.
let me.
And who really breaks the cycle of sin?
What?
Then
It's spiritual
who breaks
maturity.
the cycle of
Sorry,
sin?
Nora, who does what?
I said, who is it that breaks the cycle of sin? This went on continuously, even after Judges. You had issues with Saul and David, and on with all the other prophets in the Old Testament. And you don't really have salvation till Christ comes. That's the
And
bottom
even
line.
then, people are still sinning.
Mhm.
Let me ask you this. What if it wasn't in the Bible? What if Judges was not in the Bible? How would that affect us? Would it change anything that we believe?
As Christians, probably not. For Jews, it's a part of the story of the cycle of God's faithfulness in the rebellion of Israelites. And it's one of those things that you're meant to learn from the sins of your past and your ancestors. So when you know that this sort of, and again, if you're talking about hundreds of years of civilization and parchments and little fragments of things that are written down and being preserved, you're not going to be like, oh, that's gross how that spike went through that guy's head. We're not going to include that. You're not going to, because the larger that 30, 50,000 foot perspective is, again, if you don't remember anything about Judges, you remember there are a few judges, you remember Samson, you remember Deborah, you remember Micah, there's some of those, but ultimately what you want to remember is that it's a series of smaller accounts of military leaders who were exercising God's judgment on Israel. And what's important to note is that God's faithful, despite Israel's unfaithfulness, that God is still brings them through, but not without punishment and consequences that they incur because of their unfaithfulness. And so there's this go on.
Another thing that the Jews do even today is that they do not want intermarriage. Your kids are taught you do not intermarry.
Yeah.
Why? It goes back to this.
That's not, Donna, that's not true. That's not all.
It's not true with Reformed Jews, but with the Orthodox Jews, it is.
Yeah.
And these kids are taught you do not intermarry. We as Christians were even taught that. Because why? It contaminates your faith. It leads you into ways that you shouldn't be. And so I think that's one reason this book is in the Bible. It's to warn us that if we don't stay holy, then we're going to have a lot more troubles. I think it's very informative, this book is.
Yeah. And remember, we are different. We are completely different creatures in terms of our understanding and our hindsight and the way the Spirit dwells in us. Then this is very early civilization.
But isn't Donna right, though, that it does remind us of human depravity? I think we like to think today, well, we're pretty civilized and we're pretty moral people today, and we don't go around slaughtering other thousands of people, but there's
oh no, communist China
all the time.
Well, but I think our cycle of depravity, that we begin to drift away from our loyalty to God, and it's very easy to fall into some kind of idolatry even today. I mean, we have different kind of idols, but we have our own idols today.
Well, just look at racism in America today. I mean, that's the depravity that we live with today. I mean, we're no better than these people, I don't think, in many ways.
Right.
Because of how we treat other people. If anything, Don, I think you might be right to say, hey, that's terrible. How does that apply to my life? Well, maybe it applies in how I treat other people in racism and other things. So.
And I'll say, if you need the book of Judges to adjust your moral compass, then you've probably gone like
Yeah. Way
at least I'm not doing that. No, and I
That's a
I
low
think it
bar.
does come back to sorry, Nora, go on.
I just wanted to share, going back to the idea where you should have left it out. But I've also heard that this is a real example of Judges carries through. You see, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. We wrestle with evil. And this is a story of evil, of what happens when you don't build your strength in God and you're sidetracked. And all the murder and evil things. Look what people over in other, they chop off heads And we've had, look what the Germans did to the Jews in the gas chambers, and look what has happened in Russia in the revolution, or in China, the number of people killed, and even today, the horrible abuse in China. They're without God. And so, I mean,
Or how about
you
slavery?
don't
Not,
have a choice. If
Slavery
you've
is
done
rampant.
something that the Communist Party don't like, you're wiped out, or you're put in prison for your life. So it's, to me, yes, it's bad. There's bad evil beyond all measure in the world. And we have to try, and we're not perfect by any means, but it's a real story. It's a real story that.
and the fact of the matter is,
Go back to the true
A
king.
real story of depravity.
Pardon me?
A real story of depravity. I mean, that's
yes,
yeah.
and it doesn't really take much more to look into, beyond the boundaries, even within the Western world or within the United States. Slavery, sexual slavery, subjugation. There's all sorts of things that we can look at in our own world that are equally as depraved and horrible, and which then leads you to say, well, how much has humanity changed in X number of thousand years? We may feel more evolved, we may feel more enlightened, we may feel like loving our neighbor, and we figure out how to do that in a variety of ways. But at the end of the day, that depravity still exists. It's a human condition, whether it was then or now. And to answer your question, Jim, I guess, I kind of revealed that when we returned to it, I think it's not really, why the various stories are in there. Who knows why they end up in there? Again, that's God's direction, God's inspiration, God, that spirit-led stuff that I really can't always, no one can explain why certain things are in there. But what we do have is we have the continuity of God saying, I'm going to remain with you. And you have these verses throughout, even Judges, saying that I'm not going to break my covenant with you. These are books that are meant to tell us who God is, and who humanity is, and that never-ending relationship between the two. And at the end of the day, if you remember, that's an ugly book that journeys through these military conquests, that God was faithful. That's all you need to really remember. So, okay, it's 6:37. Anyone have any final comments? You all kind of like this book. There's a lot of energy. That tells me a lot about our own depravity. I didn't see this much excitement in Deuteronomy.
Well, it'll be real quiet.
Next week will be our last week before. Well, then we'll take a 2-week break or a couple-week break in there. We're going to look at the book of Ruth, which is a great book. Again, it's a little more of a historical narrative than it is a battle, collection of battles. And it really, but it's one of those books that really has that draws in how God was using the intermixing of cultures and tribes and peoples to really accomplish his plan for the Israelites. It's one of our shorter books, so it's only 4 chapters, and so it'll be interesting. We'll take a look at that, and then since I haven't prepared for, I don't know how long we'll teach on it, but we maybe we'll dip in and do it, since Samuel is too full. Maybe we'll bridge over a little into Samuel and then finish up Samuel on the other side. So I don't know, I got to take a look at it and figure that out. But in the meantime, I hope that you are intrigued enough by this book to go back and noodle around and see what's there. If and we're all ambulance chaser, or what was it, when you want to see an accident, we all want to see a little bit of human depravity to remind ourselves of how holy we are. I'm just kidding. It makes us feel pretty good. But no, what it should make us do is feel good that God had a plan, and despite the fact that humanity kept messing up, that God was never going to let us go. And in particular, in a time of waiting, they were waiting for something to change in their lives, and we have the benefit of that waiting with the Spirit dwelling in us. And so we wait in God's Spirit this holy season. If you haven't jumped into the narratives of the Jesse tree, I would again encourage that. You can always jump in late and get some of those narratives. It's good to be reminded of. This is our story too. And with that in mind, let me close in prayer. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and all of the stuff that followed, we know that you were present then, and you are present now, and that you were faithful then. And we claim that you are faithful to us now, and that you will see this redemption project until the end. We thank you for your word, and even though it confuses us and even grosses us out at times, we know that you've given it to us for our instruction and our formation and our understanding of who we are in you. Bless us as we depart from this virtual space, that you would dwell in our homes and in our lives in this season of Advent, that as we wait for Christmas to come, that we would turn our eyes continually toward you. Be with us that we may share your love and hope and peace and joy with those we encounter, and in doing so we might be known as your children. We pray this in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. Amen.
Man.
Everybody.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, good to
Bye.
see you all.
Bye. Good to see you.
Everybody.